Welcome, students. These notes are titled The End of the Cold War. Let's begin. Please make sure that you are using the notes 2-page chart to take these notes. It'll help you so that you don't have to write as much down, as there is a lot of information here. So make sure to use that. Let's begin. 1983, the Evil Empire speech is a speech that Reagan will give. You don't need to write this down, it's already in the chart. He basically calls the Russians an evil empire, even though he's using realpolitik to focus on the real practical approach to the Soviet Union and meeting with the Soviet Union, just as Nixon had done. He is going to use some idealism and rhetoric to call them out. He is also going to invade Grenada. There's nothing that you need to write down for that. But SDI, as has been mentioned before, is pretty important to write down. It should already be in your notes section there. But this made the USSR nervous and was a source of negotiation and put a strain on the Soviet economy as they tried to keep up. The 1985 section that you'll need to write is Glasnost, Perestroika, and the first summit in Geneva. So Mikhail Gorbachev becomes a Soviet leader. If you remember, Stalin was the leader of Russia while FDR and Truman were president. Then Nikita Khrushchev becomes the leader during Eisenhower and Kennedy's presidency. And then Brezhnev becomes the leader under LBJ's presidency. Brezhnev becomes the leader under Nixon and Carter's presidency. And so during Reagan's presidency, it's really Mikhail Gorbachev. And Reagan and Gorbachev will have a good understanding of each other, and this really helps to bring some openness and transparency between them. So Glasnost, you need to know, is openness, transparency within the government. A freer speech is allowed. Think of Glasnost as glass, which is kind of more transparency. You can see through. So think of it as that, Glasnost. Perestroika is a restructuring. And that Russian word perestroika kind of sounds like restructuring the Soviet government and economy. And so the Russians are not going to keep with the traditional Russian communism, but they're going to start restructuring things, which allows them to become more of a democratic society, so to speak, or at least leaning towards that way until the fall of communism. The first summit in Geneva is very important. No major agreements are made, but it's a positive and laid groundwork for further summits. So even though Reagan's first meeting with Gorbachev, nothing actually really happens, it's the first step. 1986 is an important year because we will have a second summit that will happen, Reykjavik Summit. This laid groundwork for arms control. There's 3 bullet points that you'll need to write down for this 1986 section. Gorbachev, main concern was dismantle of SDI. Again, remember that America didn't necessarily have the capability for SDI, but was pursuing it, that Star Wars program, and that really freaked Russia out. And so they wanted us to dismantle that program. So our bluff actually kind of worked. Reagan's main concern was reducing nuclear arms to keep Russia from having as many nuclear arms. Both presented offers, but no agreement was made at this summit either. So there's kind of a slow move that's being had. In 1987, the summit in Washington, D.C., where the Immediate Nuclear Force Treaty, INF, was signed. This is pretty important because this is the first time that a Russian president will meet with inside of America. So Gorbachev comes to Washington, D.C. INF removed intermediate range missiles from Europe and cut down on short range missiles as well. Negotiations start beginning for START treaty So again, more is made. 1988, towards the end of Reagan's presidency, you will have the summit in Moscow where Reagan will visit Russia for the first time. INF will be ratified. They discuss human rights issues, Soviet involvement around the world, namely Afghanistan. This is when Reagan states evil empire comment referred to another time, another era. So he really kind of backtracks on that evil empire idea because he doesn't want to point the finger or to blame Gorbachev. He doesn't want to make it personal, but he wants Gorbachev basically to be a new leader, to transition Russia from a communist dictatorship to a Russian republic. George H.W. Bush would be elected in 1988, and so he would continue Reagan's presidency and his policies, so to speak. This was the first time that a vice president was elected right after the president since Jackson and Martin Van Buren. So you would think that vice presidents would oftentimes be elected after a president, but usually that doesn't happen because in American society we go back and forth between Republican and Democrat, usually every 4 to 8 years, but it would take 12 years for that to happen here. And so Bush is really able to continue Reagan's focus. If another president had taken place, possibly Russia would still be communistic today. But really he's able to keep that Reagan charm and that Reagan focus there. So the fourth summit in Moscow is pretty important. Make sure that you have those two items in white written down. 1989, Soviet troops withdrawal from Afghanistan had become their Vietnam, as that I had mentioned in the past. Make sure to note that. The 3 bullet points here you'll need to write down for Tiananmen Square. About 1 million Chinese, mostly students, gathered in the square for several weeks to protest the government and call for democracy. Much as 2020 has been a year of protests, 1989 in China was a year of protest. Last year they celebrated the 30th year of the Tiananmen Square protest, and there was protest in China last year. Government responded, thousands were arrested and killed, 300 were killed. Shocked the U.S. and the world, imposed economic sanctions, the U.S. did, and so this was an event that really showed the ugliness of communism and that there wasn't free speech in China. The famous picture of the tanks stopping in front of a protester there would become iconic. A lot of memes and images have kind of poked fun at America and China's uneasy relationship. Continuing in 1989, you have the revolutions occur in Eastern Europe that topple communist control. And so you'll need to write down these 4 points right here. Gorbachev announced Eastern European countries could determine their own destinies. That was huge, and that's the big one right there that I believe started this downfall of communism. When you allow the Iron Curtain, as they used to call it, these communist nations right here in the west of Russia, known as the Eastern European nations, Eastern Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria. When you allow those to have free elections, you're going to have them turning more towards democracy instead of forced communism. Demonstrations turn into revolution and celebration, mostly peaceful. Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania are the big ones. So make sure that you have those 4 points down there. Then we get to the last thing in 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which really becomes a symbol of the fall of communism. Even though Russia will not denounce communism until 1991, it would take 2 more years. The 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall is really that picture that's important. This spurred by Eastern European revolutions, removal of physical boundaries. East Berlin announces free travel. most significant symbol of the Cold War was coming to an end. And so this wall no longer was guarded by troops or by barbed wire. If you tried to go in between East and West Berlin, you would be shot by troops. But now this wall is coming down and both sides are united. 1990, East and West Germany is reunited. Boris Yeltsin becomes a Russian president, and he will continue this easing of tension. You don't need to write anything for that section there. 1991, we have the Warsaw Pact is dissolved, so no more alliance of Eastern Russian satellite states. START is signed, cut each nation's warheads by 25%. Both America and Russia would cut their warheads down by 25%. The Cold War officially ends, and the Soviet Union is dissolved into independent nations. We gave aid to help rebuild Russia's economy. Soviets remove aid to support communist countries around the world. And so with our help to rebuild Russia's economy, kind of like we did after World War II with the Marshall Plan, we will do with Russia. And the Russians then are going to remove their support for communist countries around the world. So countries like Vietnam and Cuba that are still communist, they are not supported by Russia anymore or funded by Russia. So they're kind of off on their own. So that is the end of the notes on the fall of communism.